Hi, I'm Alexis Kid, and I will be presenting about The Catcher in the Rye. A fun fact about The Catcher in the Rye is that the murder of John Lennon was actually justified by the plot of this book. To start things off, we're going to talk about the author, J.D. Salinger. His full name was Jerome David Salinger, but his nickname was Sonny. He was born January 1st, 1919 in New York. His death date was January 27th, 2010, so he was 91 years old. He had a mixed ethnic background. His father was Jewish and his mother was Scottish, and this was uncommon for the time because most people married somebody that was the same race as them, so this was unnatural and abnormal. Salinger attended New York University at first, but then he took a year off to travel Europe, and when he came back to the U.S., he took night classes at Columbia University, but his studies were cut short because he was drafted into World War II, into the Army. The beginning of The Catcher in the Rye. When Salinger was attending Columbia University, he met Professor Whit Burnett, and Professor Whit Burnett, he encouraged Salinger to pursue a career in writing because Burnett was a writer in one of the famous magazines in New York, and he realized that Salinger had talent. In 1946, Salinger's work began to be published in a famous magazine known as the New Yorker. The Catcher in the Rye was published in 1951, and when it first came out, it was critiqued a lot by other people because it addressed inappropriate subjects that weren't normally talked about in society at the time. They were considered immoral. It covered topics such as prostitution and drinking and sex, and this wasn't talked about in society, so when this was included in the book, people were appalled. But at the same time, people are interested in these topics, so it drew people in and caused the book to be famous worldwide. And then after the book was published, it was Salinger's most famous novel, but after the book was published, Salinger almost only wrote one other book, and then he led a secluded life, and he didn't write any more books. Some similarities between The Catcher in the Rye and Salinger's life. There are actually a lot. It's interesting because it appears that Salinger wrote the book about his own life because Salinger, when he was young, he flunked out of McBurney School, and Holden flunked out of 3 schools in the book. So they both flunked out of schools. Both Holden and Salinger had a multi-ethnic background. Their parents were of different races, and both their families were well off, and both were put in a mental hospital. It's revealed at the end of the book that Holden was put in a mental hospital and is writing his story from the point of view of himself at the hospital. And Salinger was put in a mental hospital after World War II because he it impacted him mentally. The main characters in The Catcher in the Rye. Holden Caulfield was a teenager. He was 16 years old, and he's the main character in the story. The story is actually written from his first-person point of view, which causes the story to be subjective, but it's also interesting because you get to view his mind and emotions. And Holden, throughout the whole entire story, he's trying to search for, he's having an internal conflict because he doesn't want to grow up. He wants to hang on to his childhood innocence. His friends are becoming sexually active, and he doesn't feel comfortable with this, so it's causing him to isolate himself from the rest of society to try to maintain his innocence, and this just causes him to feel isolated, and he's subconsciously trying to find a companion throughout the whole novel, and it makes him depressed and ultimately leads to his mental breakdown. Allie Caulfield is Holden's deceased brother. He died when he was 11 years old because of leukemia, and he represents childhood innocence that's unchanging. Allie died when he was little, so he never fully matures, and this causes Holden to relate to Allie and love Allie because Allie never loses his innocence. So Holden really connects with Allie, and when Allie died, Holden broke all the windows in his garage, and this is the reader's first insight into Holden's actual mental breakdown and his mental discapabilities. Phoebe Caulfield is Holden's younger sister, and she also represents innocence and the vulnerability of children. And she's an important character because Holden and her connect, and she's the only character that actually understands Holden. When Holden's trying to find a companion, she understands what he's going through, and it allows her to be able to communicate with Holden and their message is the only message that gets through to Holden, and she becomes the companion that Holden was looking for throughout the whole novel. Sally Hayes was Holden's date he took to see a play, and Sally's described as phony, and phony is often referred to a lot by Holden in the book, and it means fake. And Sally is self-centered and phony, and Holden doesn't like this about her, but she's very pretty, so Holden puts up with it. And they go on a date to see a play, and then they go ice skating, and they go to a bar. And this is when Holden asks her, he thinks he's in love with her because he's trying to find the companion in her that he's searching for, and he asks her to move out west. And Sally doesn't like this idea and declines, but Holden is very angry by this, so he calls her a pain, and it causes Sally to go home crying. Jane Gallagher was Holden's secret crush throughout the whole story. She's first introduced when Stradlater takes her on a date and Holden is really angry and freaked out by this, and it causes him to beat up Stradlater because he knows Stradlater isn't the most pure guy, and Jane represents female innocence, and Holden spent like a couple summers before with her, and one of the most prominent pictures in the story is when she lines up the checkers. They play checkers a lot, and when she lines up the checkers at the end of the board, this intrigues Holden, and they also go to see a lot of movies, and they're able to relate because of their innocence together. Robert Ackley is an annoying boy at Pensy Prep, and he is described as ugly, and he's got moss-covered teeth, and he's pimply, and not a lot of people like him. And even though Holden finds him annoying, Holden and Ackley are actually really similar, because at the beginning of the story, at the football game, it's revealed that Robert and Holden are the only two people who don't attend the football game. They're in their room, and this shows how they're both isolated from society, and they both are not comfortable in their social skills. Ward Stradlater is Holden's roommate at Pensy Prep, and he's described as a secret slob because he's self-centered, he's arrogant, he's really handsome, but he's also very messy. Like, Holden describes how his room is messy and how his toothbrush is messy, and this irks Holden. And they have a one-way relationship because Holden always gives things to Stradlater. He writes an essay for him and gives him his clothes, and Stradlater doesn't really appreciate this, and he doesn't return it to Holden. So this shows how Holden is giving and trying to connect with Stradlater, but Stradlater is not willing to do so. Mr. Antolini is Holden's teacher from Elkton Hills, which is his first school that he flunked out of, and he's one of Holden's favorite teachers. But it's interesting because Mr. Antolini ends up being Holden's foil in the story, because when Holden is going through a struggle, Mr. Antolini invites him over to his house, and Holden, he gives Holden a lecture about how he feels that Holden is destined for a failure. He's destined to have a huge drop, and because of his academics, and he needs to start trying in school. And this confuses Holden and makes him feel really uncomfortable because Holden sees himself as the protector of other people. He wants to protect the children of their innocence. And what Mr. Antolini is saying is that Holden actually needs to be protected. He's the one that needs to be helped in life, and this makes Holden very uncomfortable. The summary of The Catcher in the Rye is Holden, a 16-year-old, flunks out of Pensy Prep, and he doesn't want his parents to know, so instead of going home, he roams the streets of New York for a few days before his Christmas break starts, because he was supposed to go on Christmas break. And throughout the story, he's going through an internal conflict. He's trying to come to his senses about growing up, and he doesn't want to grow up. He wants to stay innocent forever. So this causes him to help children that he encounters throughout the streets to try to maintain their innocence, as in examples like he helps a girl with her skates, he helps two boys to a museum in a dark corridor, and he goes around, he sees curse words on walls in his school, and he goes around scrubbing them off because he's afraid that people will describe what these words mean to the children, and he's really scared by this, so he goes around trying to save children of their innocence, and he's trying to come to his senses about growing up, and while he's isolated, he's also subconsciously trying to find a companion. And also the story takes place in the 1950s in New York City. The main themes of The Catcher in the Rye are the preservation of innocence. Holden, the whole story, The Catcher in the Rye, is about Holden wanting to catch children before their fall of innocence, and he doesn't want them to be exposed to the harsh world, and he wants them to stay innocent forever. Salinger also addresses the uncensored reality of the human mind. Salinger's book basically describes, it's an uncensored human mind. It talks about prostitution and sex and drugs, and this is not known to be talked about in society, yet it's what really goes on in a teenage mind, and Salinger gives the audience a view into this, and it shows that the teenage mind has to be uncensored, and it also shows the major conflicts in a teenage mind. And one of the last themes is the isolation as a form of self-preservation. Holden isolates himself from the whole entire world because he wants to preserve his innocence, and he wants to obtain from growing up, and he's not comfortable in making relationships with girls like his friends are, and so he's trying to stay isolated and stay innocent, but this also makes him very lonely, and he is subconsciously trying to find a companion throughout the whole entire book. The symbols in the story are Holden's red hunting hat. This is one of the most prominent symbols in the story. It's a symbol of Holden's individuality. He buys it at a subway station, and he only wears it when people he knows are not around. It shows how he's trying to be. He sees himself as above everybody else, but it also makes him feel isolated. And he calls it his people shooter hat because he goes around saying negative things while he's wearing it. And it also shows how how Holden is trying to relate to Phoebe and Allie because they both have red hair and he doesn't. And the hat is red, so when he wears it, it makes him feel more like his siblings. The Catcher in the Rye is actually a poem by Robert Burns, and Holden uses it. The lyrics are of a body catch a body coming through the rye. So Holden interprets this as catching children before their fall of innocence. But in reality, it's kind of ironic because the real lyrics are if a body meet a body coming through the rye, but Holden messes this up. And the real lyrics allude to sex and to sexual relations, and this is ironic because it's exactly what Holden interprets it not to mean. The ducks at Central Park also represent Holden's childlike nature because he goes around and he's very cynical throughout the book. He's very negative and just really grumpy. And then all of a sudden he's talking about the ducks at Central Park and asking where they go. And this shows his childlike behavior and his childlike inquiries in the real world, and it kind of shows how he's trying to maintain innocence. And this is my bibliography. My bibliography. And then for my creative retelling, I did a scrapbook from Holden's point of view. And it's a scrapbook from Holden's point of view. And it's a documentation of his well-known story. And the first picture is of Holden's Pensy Prep uniform. When he flunked out of Pensy Prep, he was actually indifferent because he didn't really like the school. He thought of it as phony or fake. And the motto of the school was, "Since 1888, we have been molding boys into splendid, clear-thinking young men." And this irks Holden, and he doesn't really care that he's not going to go back. The second picture is a letter from Sally, Sally Hayes. In the story, Sally talks to Holden about how she wrote a letter to him about trimming her Christmas tree with her, and she's wondering if he wants to go with her. And he never responds to the letter, but he keeps it with him, which is why it's all crumpled up and torn. This is a letter of expulsion to Holden's parents, and this is his report card. And in the story, it says how he fails every single class except English because he was very interested in English, kind of like Salinger, which is how Salinger is kind of like Holden in a way. This picture shows Holden when he leaves Pensy Prep and he roams around New York. He goes to the Edmont Hotel, and this is his room key, and he goes from Pennsylvania to New York by Grand Central Station. This is his train ticket, and he meets Maurice, the elevator operator, who sells him a prostitute, and he buys it, and when she comes up to the room, he turns her away, but Maurice beats up Holden for not paying the full $10 when he really only told Holden it was $5. And this is when Holden's hallucinations start of him being wounded by a bullet, which is consistent throughout the novel. This shows Holden's red hunting hat, which is a very important image. He bought it at the Subway for $1, and he also bought it when, at the beginning of the story, he lost the foils for his fencing team from Pensy Prep. This shows his childlike nature in forgetting things. This picture shows his constant inquiries about the fish and the ducks. He's asking where the ducks go during the winter, and if the fish freeze or what happens to the fish during the winter. And this is also a symbol of, throughout the story, it's made known that Holden is atheist and he doesn't feel comfortable with religion. So the ducks and the fish disappearing in the winter and coming back in the spring resemble reincarnation, and this shows Holden's anxiety about the afterlife and about reincarnation. Jane, this is a page dedicated to Jane. These are the checkers that she lines up at the end of the game board, and he always goes to the movies with her and they hold hands. So this shows his interactions with Jane. This is when Holden meets Carl Luce at the Wicker Bar, and Carl Luce gives Holden information about relationships, but Carl soon gets annoyed with Holden's questions. And Holden thinks that he looks really old because he has a gray patch of hair, but this shows how first-person point of view is subjective, because in the story, a lot of people don't serve him beer because he looks young, but in this case, he is served beer, and he gets really drunk afterwards, and this is leading on to his mental breakdown. This shows Holden's dream job. He wants to catch the children before they fall off the cliff, and the lyrics are, if a body catch a body coming through the ride. This is how Holden gets around New York. He gets around by taxi, and the taxi drivers always call him Mac, and this is a quote from the book. It says, "I can't turn around here, Mac. This here's a one-way." And this also shows how Holden gives the taxi driver wrong directions, which also shows his childlike nature. This is when Holden meets the two nuns at the beginning, when he goes to eat breakfast. It relates to Christianity, and it shows how he's uncomfortable with this idea. And he's really surprised when one of the nuns starts talking openly about Romeo and Juliet, because Romeo and Juliet is a romantic novel. It's not necessarily pertaining to religion, and he's surprised when the nun is talking about it, and it first shows him how Christianity isn't as strict as he once thought it was, and he feels guilty because the nuns are eating only toast and he's eating a huge bacon breakfast, so he gives them a $10 donation even though they're not accepting money. This is Allie's baseball glove. And when Allie was in the baseball field, he would get bored because he would be playing left field. So he would write poems and philosophical quotes on his glove and read them while he wasn't doing anything. And this just shows the quotes and the glove. This shows Holden's his addiction with cigarettes. Holden plays it down throughout the novel, and he says how he's not addicted to smoking, he just likes it as pastime. But at one point in the story, he explains how he has like 8 cigarettes a day, and this alarms the reader and shows the reader that although Holden doesn't play it off, he's actually really addicted to cigarettes. This is a dedication to his date with Sally. He first goes to see the Broadway play The Lunts with her. Well, it's called I Know My Love, but it's starring the Lunts, and Holden knew that Sally would like this because she loved the Lunts. And then afterwards they go to Radio City to go skating, and Sally rents a blue skater's dress, and then afterwards they go to the bar, and that's when Holden calls Sally a pain. This is a map of Central Park, and this is Holden's safe haven. It's where he feels most comfortable. He says he's been skating there since he was 8, and he knows the park like the back of his hand. And when he's drunk after meeting with Carl Luce, he goes and he's trying to find the lagoon to see where the ducks go. And he actually never finds, well, he eventually finds the lagoon. And this is the point where he mentally breaks down and where his personality shatters. This is the Museum of Natural History. And this is when he tells Phoebe that he's going out west by himself and to meet him for one last time because he won't be back. And the Museum of Natural History is actually a symbol too because it shows Holden's dream of just being frozen and being never aging. And so he even says in the book how when he's in the Natural History Museum, he feels like he's the only thing that changes because everything else is frozen. This shows the record Little Shirley Beans, and he buys this for Phoebe because he knows she'll love it because it's childlike, but the singer has a rustic voice. So he's really excited about giving it to her. But when he gets drunk, he drops it and it shatters. And this is a symbol of his shattered, he mentally breaks down. It's a point where he shatters and he has to go home to recuperate. And then this is the merry-go-round ticket. And while Holden is watching Phoebe on the carousel, at the very end of the story, he realizes that sometimes one must grow up and change is sometimes good, but it also comes with responsibility. You have a responsibility to your family. And this is also the note that Holden leaves for Phoebe at her school to meet her at the Natural History Museum. This is the psychiatric inpatient admission form for Holden, and I said that he's diagnosed with depression and schizophrenia, and he has social anxiety because it's revealed at the end of the story that he's in a mental hospital throughout the whole book. And then my last picture is a postcard from New York. This is just demonstrating the setting of the book. It was in New York in the 1950s, and the postcard was to Holden. And that's it.